Sure, won't be taking it, so please don't repeat it unless I say that I will be taking it. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Day by day, night by night, marginal minority groups have been under attacks by people because they are seen as outcasts of society. So in this debate, I will be proving to you why it is more important for these marginal minority groups to sacrifice a bit of their cultural attributes for the chance, for the option to integrate themselves into society. Now, a bit of framing. So what does marginal minority groups would look like? This would probably look like the Igorots from northern Luzon in the Philippines. This next, what does social integration mean for them? This would mean that they are being accepted by society. They are no longer the outcasts. They are no longer seen as those cannibals in living in the jungle or something. Now, the urgency of this motion, and why do we need to fix this right here, right now, and why does these marginal minority groups need to be integrated to society as soon as possible? Because first of all, these marginal minority groups don't have a way to integrate themselves into society. That's why we are giving them this option to give up these bits of their cultural attributes so that it is easier for society as a whole to accept them, so that society as a whole won't get culture shock and just wear a thong and like walk around. That may be their cultural attribute, but that is not acceptable in society standards. That is why they are currently under attack. That is why they are seen as outcasts, and that is why they need to sacrifice these bits of cultural attributes so that they can be better integrated into society. Next, next, what happens if they are not to be integrated into society and we leave them as we leave them like how opposition is going to argue? First of all, they would not have things like public support. Sure, opposition can argue that yes, the government can help them with tax money. However, we need to understand that tax money is to be used for public purposes. And if the public itself does not accept these marginal minority groups, do you really think that they would stand by as their tax monies are being used to support these marginal minority groups? When the government tries to fund them and justifies it, they would gain public backlash because, as we know, as in opposition's case, they are not being integrated. So they are seen as people who are dangerous. They are seen as people that should not be helped. They are seen as people that should be cut off from society. Next, they do not have access to, no, next is that they will eventually die out. Why is this the case? This is the case because they don't have access to progressive things like modern medicine. Yeah, you can argue that, yeah, they have their traditional medicine, but their type of traditional medicine isn't really as effective as modern medicine, because if it was, then we would be using their type of medicine and not our modern medicine. So eventually, even something like a common cough, a common cold would lead to serious damages. So with these things, we are willing to sacrifice these cultural attributes because we know, because to us their lives are more important. Their lively, whether or not they are able to live life without thinking about, oh, I need to go hunt for food. Oh, I have to prepare herbs so that I don't die if I get sick. We believe that it is better for them to sacrifice this bit of cultural attributes so that they can be better integrated to society. Now, what will happen when they do get integrated to society? This would turn, the long-term solution would be that since they have, as I said, sacrifice these cultural attributes, people will be able to accept them bit by bit. This would mean that the perception of the public will change. They won't be seen as these vulgar barbarians anymore. They would be seen that, oh, they're not so different as from you and me. They're not so different. They're just the same as us. And as for the short-term effects, this would be like access to resources like healthcare, public transportation, as I mentioned before, modern medicine. And no matter how opposition tries to argue that, oh, their arguments are lacking in this, their arguments are that, their arguments are not good enough. That does not change the fact that in government's case, we are trying to save their lives, giving them a option to like sacrifice a bit of thing so that they have a way to integrate themselves into society, because as of now, they don't have a feasible way to integrate themselves. We are giving them a way to integrate themselves because in government, we believe that their lives are more important than the culture that they are sacrificing. Even if they do sacrifice some culture, that does not mean that they sacrifice everything. That does not mean that they change their whole identity. They, of course, would still have some cultural attributes that are preserved. And in the long term, because they are now well known, they are now integrated to society, these cultural attributes would actually last longer when compared to just leaving them and not integrating them to society. And overall, I think no matter how you say it, it is in the best interest of the state, and it's in the best interest of the leaders of these marginal minority groups to help their community have a better life. And because of that, proud to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister. I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister here. And also just a reminder to everyone that POIs are a really important part of the format, so please make sure that you're offering them and accepting them as well. Thanks.
All right, can I be heard? Okay. POIs and chat, please. Let me just enable my chat feature. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As minorities, it is absolutely baffling that we have to constantly give up aspects to ourselves to be heard. This started from the lands that we had to give up to be heard, from the clothing that we wear, how we portray ourselves in society, and to the languages that we eventually have to speak to somehow be palatable and integrated within a majority society. What are the few rebuttals that I have against government before I get into my setup? The first here is just a question on what this debate really is. We don't think this debate is about an access to its societal welfare, because if the characterization is to say that governments are going to deny access to its schools, for instance, and just infrastructures that are paramount to any individual, that's just a blatant form of violation towards human rights. However, the preferable counter setup would look as such. Number one is just to note that this is an actor debate. So let's just first outline the incentives of a leader. Number one, we think we're interested in the representation of our society. This also includes maintaining a degree of influence within our own minority groups. But number two, it also looks like the preservation and sustenance of our culture to empower like individuals that look like us, or just to leave a legacy as a whole. What is the setup then? We think in our world, there's still going to be some representation within society. So it's not necessarily true that just because we look different, we're cut off from society immediately. We think there's still some form of representation, for example, a congregation of like minority groups coming together from different tribes, for example, or some limited representation within parliament. But at worst, like we think what we have is like a misrepresentation in media, for instance, as to how I'll take you in a bit. Okay. So that's how the opposition's world will look like the Orang Aslis in Malaysia or the indigenous in the Australasias, for instance, right? But number two, what we're also proving in setups, that the government would still have to care for these minority groups to a certain extent, because we view that these individuals are still drivers to the economy, for instance, they're contributors to cultural tourism, for instance. But on the last layer then, unlike being afforded privileges, we think these individuals have things like ancestral land, for instance, for governments to still care about them. But before I get into my first argument, I'll take that POI then.
3,000 people have died in the last week as a direct result of ethnic violence because people thought that the other group was fundamentally hating of them. Can we please engage with a realistic characterization?
Okay, so we think our argumentation itself will engage with that. We think the goal for government, which is to like seek social integration to be acceptable, is something that's like utterly hard. That's why at the very least in opposition, what we want to enable is the fact that we're able to retain aspects of an identity that is important to every individual within these communities, but also to enable a form of internal support that is exclusive on the side of opening opposition. First argument then on the importance of identity. We think identity is like a rigid aspect of you. These are discernible traits from how you look, the skin color that you have, or just how you portray yourself within societies. We think it's important then that as to why you need individuals that share those beliefs with you within your immediate circle. This proximate identity and like the similarity you have within immediate circles is a form of solace that happen as a response. Like there's a larger reason for you to belong to a group, and that innate feeling of unity is something that we want to retain by retaining our like unique aspects of our culture. Because the practices of our culture is like that differs from like the larger majority, often looks like how we pray to our gods, like for instance, like that we still bow down to the practice of animism, for instance, and that we have great respect towards our elders then. So what is the impact to this argument then? I think number one, what we enable here is like the enable internal support. Given that on both sides of the house, there's a greater road mapping as to how we're going to achieve, we think we provide immediate alleviation to individuals in this fight, because we enable like minorities to turn inwards for the support. The trade-off that happens in the world OG here is that they have to trade off those discernible traits for themselves. That means the moment that you seek like representation, for instance, is that for you to become the most like as a majority and you're no longer identifiable as a part of your tribe. That's the only way you're going to be palatable and have like societal changes, for instance, at the end of the day. But the unique aspect from our case here is to note that because we still practice the same things as our culture tells us that we have with respect to our ancestral practices, it means that there is greater shared experience. We share the unique pain that fellow communities of minorities have because we unite over the feeling of being discriminated and being indifferent. And as a leader, there is a greater obligation for you to stand up for these individuals and allow this space to happen in the very first place, to enable individuals to come forward and just practice parts of their culture that they are entitled to. We think individuals, within leaders of these communities are still beholden to the communities that they have, the ancestors and the spiritual beliefs. And in order for you to weigh the fulfillment of this actor themselves, we think we attain that best. But even if like you buy the case of government and that you can still have those influence without lessening cultural traits, we think that this will not come at the cost of we think that there's still a cost of resistance from your community, because the reason why they wanted your support in the first place is because they believe that you protect those identities. You have to cement this continuous support to cement your influence. That's why you cannot afford a large backlash. So the best comparative in government looks like a few things. Number one is that they're able to trade off like the discernible aspects to your identities. But the fact still remains discrimination towards your individuals are still going to happen. In fact, we argue it's worse because it becomes like forms of microaggressions, for instance, because now like just because it seems that the minority is accepting of you, then like people are not going to directly harm you. We think this is untrue and far harmful. At the end of this, then what we can conclude is we are able to form an immediate support towards minorities because we still enable the practices of cultural aspects to ensure that you're still palatable and accepted. So, but my second argument then on this strategy of social integration and why this is better. Within the greater social integration that happens in Gulf comes at a minuscule discount of the uniqueness of culture that eventually threatens like our extension. The problem here is that because like the practices of our culture is something that's just unacceptable, we think the majority will always find ways to like want to triumph. Like our language will never be good enough because you have to practice the majority language. The appreciation of nature and how you practice animism is something that's illogical. That's why you shouldn't have to do that. What this proves here is that there is the end towards the ceiling as to how much minorities have to give up for them to be socially palatable. What is sure is the culture that they're able to retain and practice at the end of the day. That's why at the end of this debate, it's still important for us to retain this cultural narrative and allow individuals to still up into the culture that's proximate to identity and to provide like a solace or a sense of spirituality refuge from the harms of the majority. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Right, I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition. I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, so once again, my name is Xandre. POI preferences would be through voices. I will not be looking at chat. I'll take one after 2, but not after 5. Allow me a moment to organize my notes really quickly and set up my timer. Thank you. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We cannot live in delusion. As someone who places heavy importance on identity and personhood, especially made manifest through culture, it saddens me to acknowledge the fact that this weight I place on culture is not held by those who have the power to erase minority groups off of the country. If we prove to you on OG that it is through social integration that we're able to immediately protect these groups, but also prove to you that we also get better protection of cultures that will still exist in spite of this integration in the long run, then we win this debate entirely. With that being said, 2 issues for the panel today with integrated rebuttals and extensions. On issue number 1 of where do we protect marginalized minority groups in the short term, we tell you uniquely coming from OG that it is through the sacrifice of sustaining unique cultural attributes that we're able to avoid the certain future that will be further marginalized until they are effectively erased. Coming from my PM, we tell you of the necessity of being able to court public opinion because the majority's perception along with the state is what guides how these groups are treated. Protection is not feasible without backlash because any taxpayer money that the state may be complicit in giving to them will be seen as a waste, and of course they will be retaliating because why are we spending all of our money on people who will quote unquote eat us? This act of discrimination is what actually forces these states to not care about these native groups or other marginalized groups for that matter because they want to appease the majority of the people. It is through the priority of social integration that we actually ensure that when the state is motivated to actually protect these groups, we are able to make sure that the state is not given backlash when they do so, which means that there is longer staying power of the effects of this protection on these marginalized groups. But unlike what they say on this situation, OO tells you that it is through this side, ergo the preservation of culture, that they're able to retain identity and unity within their community. Realize that this is illogical because this assumes that identity is contingent on culture entirely. A Native American, for example, does not need to act stereotypically Native American to identify as a Native American. One's affiliation with your heritage and roots is not reliant solely on one's ability to practice their culture. It resides within them as part of their inherent identity. And for OO to paint it as the act of cultural practice as the only thing that's keeping these groups together is a very lackadaisical way to frame this argument entirely. But secondly, they tell you that social integration will be used as a precedent for these marginalized groups to keep adjusting for the majority population. This is illogical because this assumes that once these marginalized groups are able to socially integrate, they will also still be expected to integrate more, when literally when they are already socially integrated insofar as they are widely accepted by the community, they no longer have to do it anymore. We can see this, for example, in how Black people, for example, in early America, they used to be very stigmatized, and it was only through the advent of Martin Luther King and other Black power movements that they were able to integrate themselves in society. And sure, there was backlash in that integration in and of itself, but realize we see this in the modern status quo, that Black culture is still prevalent and even celebrated unto today. So it's very illogical for them to assume that just because they're going to bend now, they're going to keep bending in the future. They do not have any framework to prove the motivation for the state or the people to keep doing that to marginalized groups. But even if that is the case, before my extension, can you give the POI?
Yeah, so Black rights were achieved through these Black people standing up and asking for their unique cultural attributes to be recognized through movements such as BLM and Martin Luther King. Why is it on your side that the white majority is unlikely to abuse this social integration and further force these people to give up their culture and be more westernized?
I don't understand why it's my burden to prove why these people are likely to marginalize the marginalized groups when it should be on your speech. So you should have said that in your speech. So for my extension, it is through social integration that we're actually able to preserve these cultures in the long run. The urgency is simple. It cannot be contested that culture remains a very important part in the identity of these marginalized groups. This is their lifeblood, the reason why they're recognized as a people. However, the reality is that these cultures are always at risk of being erased at any time, whether or not the marginalized do anything at all. It is through social integration that we gain the unique benefit of not just protecting these groups in the short term by making sure that they survive through social integration, but we can actually say that these cultures will actually survive more in the long run. There are 2 conditions of why this takes place. One, this happens when the state does not care enough about cultural footprints, especially when in comparison to what makes them the most amount of money. Realize that even without the motivation of social integration, the state can and will still erase heritage and marginalized minority groups. We see this in the demolition of cultural heritage sites for gentrification purposes, to make room for new casinos and new camellia house and lots. It is clear that the state's incentive then is where they make the most amount of money, which leads me to my second second condition. This happens when these marginalized groups' cultures are just not profitable. They barely have enough power as it is as a collective to be able to justify their protection from oppressors. Their culture just does not have the necessary capital for governments to be able to care in the first place. We see this in how protests in Mindanao staged by Luman peoples fall on deaf ears by the powerful. Our policy's effect is clear. It is through social integration that while we may sacrifice unique aspects of one's culture, it is ironically through this that we are able to solidify the longevity of a group's cultural footprints for generations. We see this in Baguio, for example, where Cordillera weaving and its surrounding traditions have become such a fixture in the economy of the city. Cordillera natives are actually accepted. Two layers of analysis. One, the state gains the incentive to protect and preserve these cultures because they see these cultures as something worth keeping now. And two, the perception of the public will also elevate because they see these cultures celebrated as they become more prominent due to government backing. But even then, let's take opposition at their best. We still win on two metrics of weighing. One on likelihood and two on immediacy. On likelihood, we gave you clear layers of analysis surrounding the psychology and incentives of various important actors from the marginalized groups themselves to the state that is oppressing them. Insofar as we prove that our mechanizations are most likely, since they are grounded by realistic assessments of actor incentives, we outweigh OO on the likelihoods of our benefits. But on immediacy, we tell you that it is through social integration that at the expense of cultural attributes that we are able to address the most pressing concerns that these marginalized groups currently face, i.e. not just cultural preservation, but making sure they are still alive to do so in the first place. Insofar as we cater to the most vulnerable actors, most important need at the shortest amount of time, we win as well on immediacy. But very quickly on issue number two, where do we protect these groups in the long term? We tell you that the prevailing narrative that surrounds these marginalized groups is of one of ignorant prejudice and biases. This lack of social integration is one of the core reasons as to why this discrimination persists, because there's no opportunity for the masses to be able to tangibly dispel them. And it is through social integration that we're able to show these people that, oh, these native peoples are not exactly as bad as we thought. It is through the social integration that they are actually exposed to these peoples on a very intimate level that they begin to realize that all of these like structural reasons as to why this bigotry exists in the first place is completely founded on nothing but lies. When they see that these people are actually acceptable, then of course they will be accepted for years to come. And this is where we completely like change the game, because not only do we prove to you that we protect these on the short term, but we also prove to you that we also protect them in the long term, because the dispelling of discrimination and bigotry will be a benefit that extends not just to our current generation of marginalized groups, but also the generations preceding it. For all those reasons and more, side with government.
All right, I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and I welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Audible and visible?
Yes.
Great. POIs in chat. 3, 2, 1. The social blackmailing that exists on the side of government further perpetuates a very racist and xenophobic state that says that for as long as you are not part of us, then you shall no longer receive all of the state welfare. The main question that I want to put here is that why was it even justified for the state to, in a way, tell these minority groups to sacrifice certain cultural attributes in order for you to accept certain parts of this welfare in the first place? If anything, this is modern form of like imperialism, where in order for you to, in a way, get all of these benefits, you have to basically get rid or erase certain part of your identities in order for you to accept this thing at the end of the day. The first attack I want to give to the side of government is what even is sacrifice and what does it even look like? Because I think in certain parts of the speech, they say, well, these kind of sacrifices are not that big of a deal that in order for them to accept even certain basic things like access to like healthcare, for example, is this okay for you to just sacrifice these parts of culture? Because at the end of the day, you can still practice this culture meaningfully at the point where you do accept all of these forms of welfare. The question I have here is, to what extent can you practice these forms of culture? Because if the state is racist enough to say that anything that you do that is uniquely cultural is one that is very shocking, that is unacceptable to the public, that means what other parts of your culture that you have to sacrifice? Because all of, at least in majority of cultures, they all intertwine in a way, because all of these cultural practices that may seem bizarre by the majority is something that is meaningful for these individuals at the end of the day. That is one clarification that Gov didn't want to say. And at the end of the day, I think the problem of just practicing culture, even after they receive all of this welfare, is one that is unclear and shouldn't give them the win. I'm going to talk about two issues in this debate. Firstly, social acceptance, and secondly, the importance of culture. Let's just take a look at social acceptance in the first place, right? Because what Gov seems to argue here is that one, culture is just too shocking, but number two, culture isn't encompassing of everyone, duh. And number three, because of the fact that culture is one that is, in a way, doesn't purport a symbiotic relationship with the majority, therefore kind of crumbles the cultural identity of a singular society. The first attack I want to make here is what part of the culture is shocking enough that it bars any form of welfare. We haven't thought of this through, but I think it looks like maybe, for example, a certain group of minorities just praying to a fish may seem a little bit bizarre, even though it's meaningful for these individuals. Even though it is unexplained, it implies two things, panel. It implies one big thing, panel, that the power asymmetry between the majority and the minority groups is one here that is large. I want to give a question in response to the POI that was given by closing government just now, that in this debate, is the majority very racist or mildly racist? If it's the former, then what you're purporting is a complete cultural erasure. Because what it means is that if one part of the culture is just deemed not accepting enough by society, that means you have a total loss for culture. And this itself could not give them the win, because it means it is a total erasure of a culture, which is not in the best interest of this leader, for example, or even just like the majority as a whole. So obviously this debate is about the latter, right? But maybe there are some form of racism within the culture, but it's not embedded enough that you have to make it contingent upon receiving welfare at the end of the day. How do we solve this form of social acceptance that becomes a question in this debate? I think firstly, the impact to my first speaker's speech was to say that we are now redefining what society looks like. It doesn't really have to be a single form of identity for society in general to harmoniously live together, because the idea of diversification actually works. The same example that government gave when we talk about America, for example, where Hispanics, where maybe certain parts of Asia that are basically just like living in America can still meaningfully practice their own culture without whitewashing themselves, without being part of the majority, of just sacrificing a lot of the cultural uniques that they have, right? The reason why this is likely going to work, panel, is because states pride themselves by having this form of diversification. Because one, it pulls in large degrees of like investments, right? Because right now we're having a war between like the global south and like the great Western economy, where, you know, Asia is likely going to like, you know, win in the future. So obviously when you pull in a lot of resources from Asia to these big like majority countries, obviously it's one that is good. Secondly, the reason why it's good, because it's a form of a positive political optics, because I think it's already clear with the era of dissemination of information that we have right now, that imperialism or modern day imperialism is just one that is just that connotes a negative spotlight. Obviously having this diversification fixes that. And that's the reason why diversification can still exist when it comes to just social acceptance without the cost of these cultural minorities just like, you know, sacrificing their own cultural identities. The POI that was given was obviously implying Palestine and Israel. The reason why that POI doesn't like, you know, affect this debate in its entirety, because that's a whole issue altogether. We're talking about like land right issues, right? Before I move on, I'll take one from closing.
I am still really unclear on what social integration is and why the actor wants it.
First of all, that's your burden to explain what social integration is. But I think what social integration means here is probably the ways in which how society itself operate, which like the context that we were trying to build in this debate, how minority groups itself mingle around like the majority of people, maybe the ways in which they interact with school, maybe the ways in which they interact in like workforce, for example, in the ways in which that basically makes one society that is whole. The idea that OO has been purporting here is that you can still have a united society without even sacrificing all of the cultural identities that are unique to these individuals, because diversification works at the end of the day. What you have to defend is a complete erasure of certain parts of culture, or to a certain extent of erasure, like justifying why is it that it's important for these minorities to just like, you know, buy into the idea that you have to whitewash yourself in order for you to just be accepted. Very racist. Second issue then on the importance of culture. I think what Aisyah already said here can be summed up into three individual things. Number one is in terms of identity. The reason why a lot of individuals crave for the purpose of life is because of the fact that they want to be part of something, that they want to see that they have themselves a certain value that they can contribute within society. The idea of which that you can be part of a certain culture that is unique to you and only you can access it with your immediate others, it's one that is good because it makes you feel like you belong to a certain group of identity. Second is in terms of connection. Sure, maybe having friends is good enough of a connection, but maybe the idea of celebrating certain religious festivities with your immediate circle, like your cousins, is one that is only uniquely accessible towards you. And thirdly is because you have a duty to your ancestors, because they've been fighting for your rights, because they've been fighting for this one singular cultural identity that was being like attacked by like past colonial powers. That's the reason why you owe your duty towards these identities. The problem here is that when it comes to just weighing these harms all together, when it comes to social acceptance and just practicing culture, is simple. Because A, welfare is given regardless of whether or not, because it is a right. If it still doesn't, then that means this state will likely going to lose voters, because obviously these minorities are just a huge voting bloc. So obviously the issue has nothing to do with welfare here. But losing culture is one that is important, because losing the uniqueness of our identity is really bad, because it comes to a part where you are contemplating on whether or not you are a part of this unique identity or the majority. Secondly, you may even lose certain parts of your connections with your God because of the fact that you are no longer reciprocal with the cultures that they are purporting. Or thirdly, you just lose all of their duties towards your ancestors. Overall, you can still have a harmonious society even without sacrificing.
All right, I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I welcome the Member for Government. Hear, hear.
Oh, what? Okay. Sorry, remember to answer those career questions. Yeah. That'll really help me.
Can I be heard? Okay. I'm assuming I can.
Yeah, sorry, your video is not on though. If you
Is that fine?
Oh, it's fine. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Panel, if I am an Uyghur Muslim in China, and the only way I can escape concentration camps is by abandoning my Turkic roots and learning Mandarin, I think that's fine. I think in many cases, there's a very big confusion in opening half about what these cultural traits really look like, because I don't think it's going to lead to the erasure of absolute, like every part of your identity. I think in many cases, it's probably going to be nuanced things that offend other cultures. I'm going to mechanize what this looks like later on in my speech. But before that, I'm going to quickly flash out what this preservation of identity really looks like, because that's a whole push on opening, whether or not integrating comes at the expense of your unique identity. I think there's a very big mismatch between cultural traits and identity, because I don't think they're going to ask you to change your skin color. I don't think they're going to ask you to like change your God. I don't think those are things that are particularly offensive to people. What this probably looks like is like not eating pork in a Muslim country. If you're a non-Muslim minority in a Muslim country, you probably shouldn't drink alcohol outside. The fact of the matter is that these are often cultural traits that you can give off while still being able to maintain your broader identity. These aren't self-centered around your identity. These are just cultural attributes that you build around that. We don't think it's justified in order for you to die for those things. But secondly, I think in many cases, these are often externally embodied cultural traits, which means they're often things that you propagate outside, which means you probably shouldn't drink alcohol in the UAE because you're probably going to get discriminated for it. The fact of the matter is that people often can give up these cultural traits while also being able to maintain the broader aspects of their culture, such as believing in their God, etc., etc. But thirdly, I think in many cases, people want peace. We think that any conflict that exists in any country is often not good for either party. Most people want peace because we think that it often requires a large amount of resources to discriminate against minorities, because you have to like squash uprisings. You have to like actively force people to hate against other people. There's large degrees of propaganda. We think that the governments as a whole have an incentive to ensure maximal productivity and integration. But I think there are often offensive traits that people embody, which means that the government cannot morally do so because it goes against their own moral philosophies. I'm going to address that quickly off top. But before that, a bit of reframing as to why this debate probably occurs in third world countries. We want to characterize that in many first world countries, there's already large degrees of social integration. Black communities in countries like the US already have social integration, which means in many cases, this is going to exist in third world countries where there's ethnic divides, it's probably post-conflict zones, large degrees of like language barriers, etc. We want to characterize these governments as being very, very unstable. They're probably weak democracies or weak authoritarian states. Think about the DRC, think about Congo, think about Nigeria, think about Sudan, and the genocide of like minorities in those kinds of countries. These are probably the countries where this debate realistically occurs on, which means integration in and of themselves probably means that you're going to have an integration in the education system. You're probably going to nationalize one language. You're probably going to be able to learn alongside other kinds of people. which means that in many cases, we think that it's going to lead to like the reduction of ethno-violence because there's no tribalism. People don't exist within their own vacuum chambers, which mechanizes all the harms that they push out. But secondly, we think that in many cases, the narrative against minorities in these states are probably going to be narratives that often force the minority to seem as though they're against the state in and of themselves. What does this look like? It looks like even in like countries like the USA, the fact that Muslims are against the entirety of the state, by extension, Muslims are bad. The fact of the matter is that when you show an active incentive in trying to benefit the state, in many cases, we don't think these narratives are going to exist. If Muslims gear up or like Mexicans gear up on the border and say, we want to help nationalism and the United States liberty, we don't think that governments are going to oppose that because they can no longer consider that narrative and weaponize that narrative. We think that's important. But quickly then on I'm going to do one really big thing in this debate, and I'm going to address the kinds of marginalized minority groups that actually exist, because I think there are broadly three kinds. Firstly, they're probably geographically isolated minority groups, which means due to large degrees of social and cultural isolation, the minorities are often somewhat offensive to each other because they build traits that the others oppose because of a tribalistic mentality, which means things like eating beef or pork shouldn't be done in countries like India because you're going to offend other minorities. You can like choose not to do that. But secondly, we think it's probably going to be people who move in. Think about like Jewish exodus, think about Nigerian Muslims moving south, think about like moving of Rwandan people across the Congo. What this means is that often your cultural attributes are not economically feasible. The fact that in Nigeria, a lot of herders have to transform into farmers and thus lose the cultural aspect of their herding probably means that they can earn more by losing those cultural traits because the system that they live by, the structural barriers of those systems are often those that welcome certain traits and certain cultural embodiments. The fact that you're a farmer in Nigeria means you earn more as opposed to being a herder. These are often many things that they need to consider. But thirdly, we think there are often incentives for people who move in. Think about colonialization, think about white people moving into Aboriginal land. We think that in those kinds of cases, it's probably recognizable that this isn't where this debate takes place, but in many cases, your culture is going to die off anyways. We think it's good that you make the concession instead of the overall erasure. I think the unique extension we add to this debate is to notice that this is an actor incentive motion, which means that in many cases, we have to approach this from an actor point of view. As minority leaders, what do we want? I'm going to address that and uniquely weigh this against their opening argument. But before that, take out a POI, whoever wants it.
Yeah, if there was a conflict where groups don't have any other choice but to integrate to save themselves, as your opening line, why are we even having this debate?
Because you want to maintain culture at the expense of death. That's your whole case, right? Which I think is problematic. We don't need that. We think it's fine. I think this debate isn't necessarily about that, but that was just an illustration of what this debate probably looks like. I think I'm going to address the incentives of leaders really quickly, because I think it's likely you're someone like Martin Luther King. You're someone who garners large degrees of social traction, which means you put yourself at substantial personal risk every single time you rally with the minorities because you have large degrees of social hatred. The only way to squash minority movements in third world countries is to kill off the minority leader, because in many cases, these are the people who are the most educated in the minority group. These are often the people who are like the most like rallying. They're able to gain the largest degree of social traction. You have active incentives to let these people go, which means but secondly, you need large degrees of respect from the community, which means there's social proofs. At the point at which you're able to encourage integration, you're going to gain that social proof and by extension validation. But secondly, you're probably somewhat self-centered because people from minority leaders are probably going to be someone who come from aristocratic roots. You're probably a minority king. You're somewhat rich. You probably come from hereditary power. You're probably somewhat intelligent, which means you have self-interest in mind. You have to return to your business. You have to return to local assets, etc. Often the minority quibbles that exist within social dynamics often hinder your ability to actually do this effectively, which means on an individual level, you have an obligation to look out what's best for you and your family. You shouldn't have a bullet shot through your head. That's the point we're trying to make. But thirdly, we think that in many cases, you're only going to put up with discrimination insofar as it's actually helpful to you, which means that in many cases, on our side of the house, you're able to integrate to like the broader political system. You're able to attain like a seat in parliament at the point at which you socially integrate because it's a quid pro quo system. Notice that majority leaders have active incentives to actually ensure you integrate into society because pushing away minorities is often very harmful. Their side, the best way to do this is to get rid of the minorities. Think about like South Sudan genocide. That's why we're so proud to stand on closing government.
All right, I'd like to thank the member for government. I welcome the member for opposition.
Sorry. I'm not going to be opening my camera, by the way. Starting my I'll take my POIs verbally. And unless I outright reject them, you can assume that I'll take them later, so you don't need to repeat. Okay, send my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think what's really missing from every side of the house here today, excluding closing opposition, is the magnitude of this case, right? We've stated to you, right, as to why that unity which exists within these communities are so important in ensuring that there is a continuous political will of the people to demand the government to act in a certain manner. Understand, when it comes to the topic of advocacy and the best interest of these leaders of these activist groups or these marginalized groups, what's really important is ensuring that the people are able to tell the government exactly what they want, the type of behavior that they expect, not just on a domestic scale, but also an international scale. Understand that the government's behavior is often a reflection of the people, particularly in these stronger states such as the US or the UK, Germany, so on and so forth. It's often an expression of the political will of the people, and what the people express is how the governments will act. So let's go through this by house, right? Let's start with opening opposition. They've given us two things. They talked about how the people are likely to experience a culture shock, and there is a need to make these groups more palatable. The specific examples that they gave is that these groups are often cannibals or tribalistic. So first, as a human being, I'd like to point out, and I can't believe I'm doing this, that this is just pretty much outright racist. Also, as a debater, it is that this mindset is the exact problem, no thank you, is the exact problem which needs to be overcome in the first place. The fact that these individuals are being perceived as such, despite not being such, is the issue at hand. Now, we've asked them, right, as to why this allows, as to how you prevent further marginalization from the majorities through this abuse of power and this power disparity that you allow. And we were told that this is not their burden, but rather something that we have to prove. So I'll tell you as to why you allow further marginalization when you try to make these groups more palatable. First and foremost, understand that this social integration is in fact in favor of majority, because this lack of palatability or this perception of such was the problem in the first place. Because what you are choosing to do is expose these majorities to the individuals, but not their culture. Because the exact thing that you are fighting for is for these minorities to give up their unique cultures for the sake of the majority. But yes, I'll take your POI from opening.
We already told you that the erasure of culture and the existence of discrimination. You said opening. I'm sorry.
Yeah, a bit louder,
Oh, we already told you that the erasure of culture and the existence of discrimination exists either way. You need to provide the mech to prove how prioritizing cultural preservation stops this erasure.
I'll tell you in a second. So understand that this social integration is in the favor of the majority because you're exposed to the individual, not their culture. In other words, what you are telling this group to do is to give up the things that they previously fought to defend, which you previously told them to fight to defend. So even in your best case scenario, right, where people are like, sure, I'll do this. What you're actively doing is allowing the majority to believe that these people don't have this culture to defend, and these things can be given up because integration is more important. What you fail to mechanize is this idea. Before I get to that, but secondly, in your worst case scenario, and what is much more likely is radicalization, is that these groups will be more split up as a result because they believe that the culture does not deserve to be prioritized. But secondly, what they told us, right, is about cultural preservation, which first and foremost was very assertive. They told us that the state will now have more interest to protect these cultures because they see these people as more palatable and worth protecting. But understand, how does this preservation usually happen? This is something that happens by generation. Things such as listening to Azan on the speakers from your local mosque or getting traditional food for lunch at school. What you are giving up is no longer having these things in public, which means that you have these children who believe that these things are not a necessary part of them, and their culture is no longer necessary, and the likelihood of being westernized is much higher. But also understand that this government incentive is much lower because you do not see these individuals representing their culture and fighting for that culture to be represented. Yeah, sure. Let's take a POI from closing.
POI.
Yeah. Closing.
The degree of cultural erasure minority leaders are going to suggest is going to be proportional to the risk that the minority group faces.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about this risk. And I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to closing government, right? Okay, so they told us three things. First and foremost, they introduced their framing or their premise towards us about how this happens in unstable states and how these people shouldn't have to die for refusing to eat pork or drink alcohol. Understand why this is this is unlikely to be good. Understand that the very examples given by them are things which are often religious rulings, religions which are dogmatic, religions which these individuals are indoctrinated to, which which means that quality of life decreases a whole lot when you tell them that you should go against your own religion for the sake of the majority. They told the very opening line was that these Uyghur Muslims, if they are able to escape from these camps as a result of giving up their identity, this is a good thing. But the thing is, what you do is that the individual escapes from the camp and you do not get rid of the camps. So two things that we need to question in this whole topic of sacrificing this is better than dying, right? Is would these individuals be willing to give up their identity, given that these very cultures that you've introduced are ones which often push things such as martyrdom? The idea of dying for a religion is in fact one of the best things that you could do. The second, understand that why our side gets rid of the camps, or rather the oppressors, is because through this activism, which pushes you to validate these cultural differences, is you set a precedent for your governments to also recognize other states which are different from them. No, thank you. But third, you told us about the security of the leader, about how these leaders are going to get killed off, right? But understand that in activism, this is in fact because again, these cultures often push this idea of martyrdom, which means that this is likely to increase the political will of the people as they see just how much they are really being harmed, to the extent that their cultural leaders are now being punished for representing their culture. And how this materializes, right? The increased political will of the people. It means that you vote in governments which are more likely to protect you, and the fear of being different is much, much lower. But lastly, why is it that we deserve to be prioritized? Because we are the only side which really acknowledge the magnitude of the situation. If we were to compare ourselves to opening opposition, if we were to compare ourselves to opening opposition, right, the only thing they've really told you is an internal scale within these groups, these cells. But we tell you how this mechanizes into better policies which not only protects these groups, but also reduces conflicts in states such as the Palestine-Israel conflict, such as Iraq, Afghanistan. We stated this to you before, right? In our memo, we talked about how these certain states are more likely to receive help. Certain international groups are more likely to receive help because they are whiter, because they are more westernized. But we believe that these groups, which are more conservative, which are more traditional and cultural, also deserve to be prioritized rather than giving up their identity, the very identity that they have been punished for. We uphold these principles and we acknowledge the fact that these individuals are very, very unlikely to be willing and are more likely to rebel against their own leaders, split up among themselves, be further polarized among themselves, because you are asking them to give up something as dogmatic as religion. And for all of those reasons, closing.
All right, thanks everyone for the debate. Feel free to do the virtual handshake. And then if you want to return to the main Zoom room, I'll send either a panelist or a trainee out to collect everyone when the OA is ready. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks for the debate.
Crosshouse gamers.
Thank you.
Thanks for the round.
Jordan.
Hello there. Nice to see you again.
How are you?
Yeah, good. Oh, man. Sorry, org